Hello, folks. I'm speaking to you, some of you here in the audience, through a translator. So I'm going to try and speak a little bit more slowly than I usually do. When I speak to a fully English-speaking audience, I speak more like this, pretty fast. It's very hard for the translators to keep up. So I'm going to slow down a little bit. So my latest game, 1 Hour, 1 Life, came out on Steam back in November. Came out off of Steam back in February of 2018, so it's been out for about 15 months. And it's my 19th game, and I've been making games for 15 years. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is just the sort of trajectory of that process of making games over all those years and where I've been trying to go and where I kind of came from. But before I get into that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the format of this talk, which is a little unusual. So when you get invited to give a talk, which I do from time to time, preparing a really good linear talk, like a PowerPoint-style presentation, where you're making a clear, cohesive argument. For me, because I'm a perfectionist, takes me sometimes 2 weeks to make a really good one, like if I'm giving a talk at GDC, Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, or something like that. And so, for the most part, I say no when I'm invited to give a talk, because I don't have 2 or 3 weeks in my schedule to prepare that kind of talk. However, the reason why I can't just prepare one talk and give it over and over and over to all the different audiences that I'm invited to speak in front of is because of YouTube. Every talk is now going directly online, and anybody who's been following my work will have watched the talk and be disappointed that they're coming into the audience and seeing the same talk that they saw me give in some other city. So that doesn't work either, right? So you can't just prepare one talk and give it over and over. You really need a unique talk for each situation. I've seen other speakers outside of games. I've seen Oliver Stone, Gloria Steinem, Chuck D from Public Enemy, Terrence McKenna, some of these people I saw in college on speaking tours. And what did they do? They weren't giving a prepared talk. They just kind of got up on stage and talked, but they didn't have any visuals. They just got up there and talked, and anybody in the audience who is more of a visual thinker was sort of left behind. It was just sort of an ad-libbed, spontaneous talk given with just words. So visuals are nice, especially when you're talking about games, which are a visual thing. I mean, if I start talking about 1 Hour, 1 Life, and there's people in this audience who have never heard of it, like, how do they even know what I'm talking about if I have no visuals? So I need visuals, but how do you make nonlinear visuals? So I developed a tool that I'm debuting for the first time at this talk, and I've actually got, so my main laptop is up here with the image on the screen. I've got a separate little touch screen over here with a bank of images that I can hit when I want to switch images. So if I want to switch from 1 Hour, 1 Life, which is my most recent game, to my very first game, which is Cultivation, I just touch the screen and it switches like that. So this tool is actually an open source tool that I developed. It hosts the touch screen through a web interface. So you can actually have multiple touch screens for multiple presenters if you want multiple people to be able to change the images in a panel or something like that. I'm just going to briefly put the URL for the GitHub up on here in case anybody wants to take a look at the software. It's open source and available on GitHub. Anyway, so that's what I'm trying here for the first time, giving a spontaneous, nonlinear presentation with images to back up the stuff that I'm saying, chosen as I go along spontaneously. So this is not a linearly planned talk. Okay, so let's get back to what I was talking about before. So 1 Hour, 1 Life, like I said, is my 19th game. I've been doing this a long time. You know, some people have described what I'm doing, or at points in my career I've described what I'm doing as art games, which are, you know, games that are supposed to have some sort of artistic purpose to them. Games that are, I don't know, some people think of games as idle entertainment, and what if a game could be more like a great movie or a great piece of music or something like that? What would that mean? So that's kind of the question that I've been trying to answer throughout my career. Even going back to, you know, this was my second game actually, not my first game, Cultivation, up through my most well-known game, Passage, which is actually more popular than that. The Passage came out in 2007. It's by far my most popular game in terms of the number of people who've actually played it. But if we go back in sort of a time machine back to 2005 when Cultivation came out, or 2007 when Passage came out, the way we were thinking about games back then was very different. And we were trying to sort of change or transform the industry. We were outsiders to the industry. Independent games as a cultural phenomenon and especially as a commercially viable phenomenon didn't really exist. Like, there were not people making independent games and putting them on Steam, because I don't think Steam existed, and making lots of money with them. It was just like the people who were making money and living with games were in AAA. And we were, at the time, very excited as an industry about statistics like this. This is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which came out quite a long time ago. But at the time, the industry was basically saying, hey, look, we have arrived. We have cultural currency. This game, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, made over, I think it made $1 billion as a single entertainment work. And they were like, $1 billion. This is more than any movie in history. This is more than any box office record. Oh my gosh, we are so important. But then when you actually look at the number, you're like, well, they sold 20 million units of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which is a lot of units for a video game. But then you go and maybe compare it to a movie. How many units does a popular movie sell? Like Avatar. Avatar sold 350 million units. Titanic sold 400 million units. How about an older movie that's even maybe more popular, and it's hard to believe how popular it was. Gone with the Wind sold something like 1 billion units. And to put that in perspective, here's the world population at the time it came out, right? This means that almost like half the people on planet Earth saw Gone with the Wind, right? And once you get these statistics up on the screen, we look at Call of Duty here, and it's like 1 finger tall, right? So we were all excited about this, but the reality is, especially back then, and still today, this has not changed. This has not changed. No one had even heard of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 back then. Walk down the street and ask somebody on the street, hey, have you ever heard of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2? And they'd be like, what is that? Right? I mean, yes, everybody in this room back then, the equivalent of people in this room, game developers and gamers and people who are into gaming culture, they all knew about it and had heard about it, and many of them had played it. But not like if you walk down the street and say, have you ever heard of Gone with the Wind? And everyone will be like, oh yeah, that was a movie, right? Even if they don't know anything about it, they know kind of like people wouldn't even know Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 was a game. They wouldn't know anything about what it was like. They might know, Gone with the Wind was about the Civil War or something, right? About Charlotte O'Hara, they might say, right? And Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is about, they wouldn't know anything. They wouldn't know it was a shooter. They wouldn't know it was about, I guess they'd guess it was about war. Maybe if you told them it was a game, they might guess it was about war. So games, and that hasn't really changed. I mean, you could say, League of Legends or something has how many, hundreds of millions of people who have played it, right? And games as a cultural phenomenon have, of course, grown, but they've grown in a very niche way. They've grown with a very narrow audience of people. And even the great inroads that we've made in terms of making games over the past 15 years that are artistically and culturally valuable and relevant and so on. I mean, those games are not played by lots of people either, right? I mean, my games that I've worked so hard to develop, like a game like 1 Hour One Life, I mean, no one's heard of it. I mean, maybe some people in this room have heard of it, but no one's really heard of it. Jonathan Blow yesterday was talking about his game Braid, and this game had a huge impact on the world of game design, right? But you walk down the street and say, hey, have you ever heard of Braid? And then they might say, you mean that thing Soulja Boy played? I don't know if you guys have seen that video. So anyway, it's just, and even if they've heard of it a little bit or something, maybe they saw Indie Game the movie, that has brought more cultural currency to video games than anything else. I mean, whenever I mention to people that I make games or I'm an independent game developer, they're like, yeah, I heard about you guys. I saw that movie on Netflix. What was that about? That French guy who was really depressed. And that bald guy who made that game with the, I don't know, a platformer or something. Yes, that's those, I know those guys, I would say. And they'd be like, really? Okay. So I feel like we're kind of kidding ourselves when we imagine that we somehow have arrived, that we somehow have had some greater impact on culture. And I think, there's good reasons for that historically, and there might be fundamental reasons for that in terms of why that will never happen. And I'll get to that maybe in a little bit. But okay, rolling back in time, going back to this era when we're talking about Call of Duty and comparing it with the world population of 1939, and thinking about why wouldn't people on the street care about Call of Duty Modern Warfare if we told them, hey, you should really go play this, and they went to play it? What would they come away with, and would they come back to us and say, thank you for telling me, oh, it was so amazing? They probably wouldn't, right? They might go to see Titanic and say, wow, that was a great movie. I'm so glad I saw that. They might go to maybe Avatar and say that as well. But I don't think the majority of people would come out of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 and say, oh my gosh, that enriched my life. I'm a more intelligent, more emotionally savvy person because of it, or any of that kind of stuff, right? So we were trying to at least, going back to like 2005, 2006, could we at least make something like Titanic in games, right? What would we're not even talking about really high art here, right? We're talking about something that has some sort of meaning to people, right? So, and something that has broader appeal. So, this is a funny question, right? But what's the, people talk about the Citizen Kane of games, right? Which is the great work of monumental cultural achievement taken from film, Citizen Kane. What is do we have the Titanic of games yet? That's kind of funny to think about a sinking ship and compare your game to that. I don't mean the game that went down in flames. I mean, a game that at least, moved people and felt meaningful to people the way even a very popular, somewhat shallow film like Titanic. And I love Titanic. Titanic is an amazing movie for what it is, and it is a great film in a lot of ways. But I don't think we even have a game that we can compare to that. So that brings me to this slide, which is a slide that I used to be really fond of putting up on the screen. And so up above the red line, this is sort of a cultural line in the sand. And above the line are mediums that have shown themselves to be capable of, I don't know what we can describe them, like masterpiece level, great works of art and cultural significance, right? The kinds of things we'd want to put in the time capsule of humanity once the earth is destroyed. I don't know, these kinds of things. Like theater, right? Or novels, or photography, or movies, films, paintings, sculptures, and music, but even rock and roll, right? Even rock and roll has gotten to that point. And it got to that point like 40 or 50 years ago, where we're like, wow, rock and roll has gotten to this point where it's, lots of people would put, some Beatles album or some Bob Dylan album in the time capsule, right, of humanity. And then down below the line are some games I picked as, at the time, if we go back into the 2005, 2006, these are some of the highest pinnacles of artistic kind of achievement within the realm of games. Games like Shadow of the Colossus, or even going further back in time, like the original Legend of Zelda, or Metal Gear Solid 2. And it's hard, very hard. People talk about Shadow of the Colossus a lot. It's an amazing game, one of our great achievements, I think, in a lot of ways, culturally. But you can't really put it on par with Lolita, or like a great David Lynch film, or like a Beatles album, right? It just, as great as it is, it just feels like it's not quite as complex. It's not quite as culturally relevant somehow. And so the question is, can we get across this line? What does it mean to get across this line? What would games do to get across this line? And back then, we had this, and I'll say briefly that this was actually not a new idea in 2005. This is an ad from Electronic Arts. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of the game development company Electronic Arts. It was this tiny little company that no one had ever heard of back in the day, and they placed this ad in video game magazines that says, "Can a computer make you cry?" They didn't say, "Can a computer game make you cry?" Anyone who's used Windows 10 long enough can answer that question. Like if I was using Windows 10 right now instead of Linux, I'd be getting an update that would interrupt my presentation, right? So yes, we know that a computer can make you cry. Can a computer game make you cry, though, is the question I think they're really asking. And they were showing, very unusually for the time, this group of artists. Look at them, look at the way they're sitting, look at the color of their clothes. They're wearing black clothing, artists. And they're looking cool. We don't look this cool. They're looking cool, they're looking like artists. They're each individually named in the ad. Down in the corner there, they name each person and each of their individual works. They're being treated like artists or auteurs. And they go through in this text explaining their grand vision for how they're going to transform games as this small independent company with all these little individual auteurs making great artistic works that are unique to games and so on, toward a language of dreams, right? Toward a language of dreams. Are we here at this conference working toward a language of dreams? Is that what we're doing here? This was in the mid-1980s. So it's an old idea. So in 2005, basically, this was a resurgence or a renaissance of this idea. There was a new generation of creators asking this question again. Can a computer make you cry? Okay, so at the time, we were sort of making progress in AAA games, but progress in a way that we all felt was very unsatisfying. And thank goodness, I think that the industry has pretty much moved away from this for the most part. But when you look at this and you're like, well, if these are down here and these are up here, where are they going to go? What are they going to get close to if they're going to get up here and be we don't know how to make artistic things with games and programming and interactive mechanics and so on, but what's the thing they're most similar to up here, right? Games aren't really like paintings, not really. They're not really like sculptures. They're definitely not like rock and roll albums. Not like photographs, those are still kind of like plays a little bit, not really like novels. That's all about words and prose and the arrangement of words. Kind of a little bit like moving pictures. I mean, games are made of moving pictures, right? And so I think that back then, the predominant way, like a game like Metal Gear Solid 2, has sneaking missions and kind of cool interactive segments, and then there'd be this segment of story that would play. The term for it at the time was cutscenes, and that's still a term we use, but a lot of games don't have those very much anymore. But you play the game for 15 minutes, and then you'd watch like a 5-minute cutscene, and then and sometimes in the cutscene something dramatic would happen, like a favorite character would die, and one of the characters would be crying, and there'd be music playing that really felt like, like we were trying to kind of be like movies, right? Like if we kept making more Metal Gear games, eventually, if we made an infinite number of them, we'd eventually become kind of like a movie. That maybe it's not just a movie. That we were dreaming at the time that we were going to make interactive movies of some kind. Maybe fully interactive movies of some kind. And what did that mean? How would we do that? Interactive movies, we wanted to replace movies. A lot of people then were talking about, someday we're going to replace movies, that people aren't going to go to the movie theater anymore. They're going to be talking about the latest interactive thing, which is kind of movies and games merged. But the way we were doing it at the time was not at all satisfying, right? It didn't feel like an interactive movie. It felt like a little bit of interaction and a little bit of movie. Like an interaction and like an interactivity and movie sandwich, right? And that doesn't feel satisfying. It feels like we're kind of using movies as a crutch, right? We're kind of like saying, well, we know how to tell evocative, dramatic, artistic, make moving linear moving image segments that do this. We know how to do this. So maybe if we want to make our games do this, we just stick little movies in there, and that's how we're going to do it. But back in the history of movies, they actually were doing this quite a bit. When they didn't know how to express something in a filmic way, in a cinematic way, they would put a bit of text up on the screen, right? So you would never see this in a modern movie. And the reason is that directors quickly figured out how to express this idea to you, that the scene you're going to see now is the next morning, right? And they do it in a cinematic way. They don't have to tell you, this is the next morning, just in case you didn't know. What would they do, right? They would show characters going to bed at night and going down with their head on the pillow, and then they'd suddenly show the lighting in the room change, right? And an alarm would go off, and the character would reach over and hit it, and their hair would be all messed up, and they'd have drool coming down, and the bright sunlight's in their eyes, and it's very clear that it's the next morning, right? There's no confusion about it. So, but back in the day, they didn't know how to. So the question was, is there going to be some way that we're going to get away from sticking little bits of movies inside our games and somehow make somehow fully interactive stories? I feel like that's a bit of a pipe dream, and it still is. I mean, we're talking 15 years ago, they were dreaming of doing this. They still haven't really done it today. There are some games that made some supposed strides. One way to do it, obviously, is to give people a bunch of choices, right? Have these points in the story that stop. This is sort of the Mass Effect model, I guess, right? Where you have points in the story that stop, and you're supposedly given a weighty choice to make. And then the other one is a game like Facade, which is is using artificial intelligence, right? But the artificial intelligence in Facade wasn't quite good enough, but we might imagine that if it got better and better, if someday we got to this, if you have a real AI, someday we have real AI, like Hal, have Hal tell you a bedtime story and have him make it interactive, right? That'll solve the problem. But that's sort of just kicking the ball down the field, right? It's well, someday, 15 years ago, we were saying probably in about 10 years, we're going to have artificial intelligence that's so good that it'll be able to make interactive stories for us that are compelling, or interactive characters that are compelling. And that obviously never came to pass. And I don't think it's going to come to pass. I don't think it's coming to pass. And I'm a pretty hardcore AI skeptic. I've been listening my entire life to people telling me that AI is going to do this or that, and it never has, right? I mean, yes, AI beat a grandmaster at chess, and now it's beat a grandmaster at Go. And it's made some really cool-looking pictures now, like Google Deep Dreams and style transfers and stuff. I mean, it's done some cool things, but it has never taken any strides, really, toward this at all in my entire lifetime, and predating my lifetime of people dreaming about this. So we're not going to kick the ball down the field and hope for them to solve the problem for us, right? And the reason that this approach, while somewhat promising, so most games that do this do it in a very fake way, right? Most games that do this give you these choices that aren't real choices. They kind of are little pretend choices that make you feel like something. Any big thing that's going to happen in the story is going to happen regardless of your choices, because games are expensive to make, and all that content is expensive to make, and they're very afraid that a player is going to play through the game and miss all this expensive stuff they spent time making. So they can't have this huge branching crazy tree where the player just goes through one little narrow branch and only sees 1/10 of the content. They have to make sure they funnel the player down all the right passageways so that they see all the expensive stuff that they spent time making. But this game, Mask, which came out quite a long time ago, probably sometime in the late 2000s, or mid to late 2000s, actually does the branching multiple choice story for real, right? Because the content is very cheap to make, it's just these still drawings. They give you a choice almost every sentence, almost every little micro interaction. You have a pretty divergent list of choices. Do you threaten to kill him? Do you surrender to the police? Do you make a bargain with them? Do you almost kill the guy? Those are pretty different choices in the heat of the moment in this game. And if you take one of these choices, it leads to a completely different. Like if you surrender to the police, you end up in jail, and there's this whole section of the story that's in jail that's totally different from the rest of the story. So they do it whole hog, right? Which is way better than fake choices that most games offer, but it still feels like it doesn't really work, and I think the reason is because players know that the choices aren't real. There's no consequence. They can always play this game over again and try the other choice. So if you say oh, here's some beloved character, and you're about to drop him off a cliff, and let go or hold on, and get pulled over yourself, and you're like, oh, I let go, oh no, he died. He didn't really die, right? Not only did he not really die in real life, which is obvious, right? The character that's dropped off the cliff in the movie doesn't die in real life either, right? But it feels less real than the movie, Because in the movie, there's only one ending. The character fell off the cliff and died, and you never get to know what happened the other time. There's no alternative reality. Here, games give you the explicit knowledge of an alternative reality where you can go and explore this other path later. So the choice doesn't, even if it's real, and you could really kill this guy, it doesn't really feel like it has consequence, right? So that didn't feel that satisfying. And so we were sort of stuck, right? It's like, yeah, we don't really have an approach, right? We don't really have a way to jump across and become like fully interactive movies, right? We don't really have a good way to do this. It doesn't seem like iterating in this way will eventually lead us anywhere good. And so then the question becomes like, how do we do it in some other way, right? That's the question that I was trying to answer early on in my career. Like, what if we drop this idea of fully interactive movies and try to figure out how games could do something unique in their own way, right? Maybe a little bit like the way a comic, the ultimate sort of, most complex and interesting graphic novels. This is an example page from Chris Ware, who a lot of people see as one of the greatest, graphic novel kind of artists working today, is leveraging the medium in, he's making these kind of complex diagrams and showing multiple paths through history and different things that happen simultaneously in a house in a very complicated way that could only be done in a comic book, right? It doesn't feel like it's copying a movie. It's not trying to be cinematic in any way. It's not trying to be like a novel really in any way. It's not really text heavy. I mean, there's some text on the screen here and there, but it's mostly about letting your eye follow all these diagrams and realizing how the diagrams relate to each other. That's like, it seems like maybe comics have kind of figured out how to do things in their own way. While again, though, not having any cultural impact. So that's a different question to address later, maybe. Okay, so going back in time, one answer to the question was in my game Cultivation and a couple of other games that were being made at the time, and some people have tried this even in more modern games, is that we're going to build some kind of mechanical system and give the player choices within that system. And because it's in a system and because it's not a branching story, the choices feel like they have consequence because it's in the midst of a simulation somehow. But that the choices that you make, like you're in control of one character in here and there's some other characters around in the simulation and you can choose to interact with these characters in different ways that has some permanent consequences. And somehow in making different choices, like are you going to be a nice guy in the game or are you going to be a mean guy in the game? That's going to make you reflect to yourself like, why did I make the choice that I did? And then think about life or something, right? This is the idea that the player is going to reflect and have sort of an artistic experience by reflecting on the choices that they made inside the context of the game. This, again, for the same reason, I think that the choices in a branching story web don't really feel that impactful, doesn't really work, right? So I made one game like this and I was like, that doesn't really feel like it's going to be a good path forward. And so for my next couple of games, like Passage, and Onward for a few games in a row, the idea was, what if, kind of like the way Chris Ware is using kind of the mechanics of comics to do something artistic directly with the mechanics and like the drawings on the page, right? Like, can we figure out, and what, for games, what is that? What's the equivalent of that, right? You're not gonna have lines on a page, right? You have game mechanics, right? You have, I think it's pretty clear to everyone in this room who's a game developer what game mechanics are, but when I'm explaining it to a non-gaming audience, I often use Pac-Man as an example. It's just like, what are the rules, the fundamental rules of this universe, right? Like a game mechanic is, you really can distill it really down to just like cut and dried, right? So Pac-Man can move north, south, east, and west through this maze. That's one game mechanic. Pac-Man, if he touches one of those those little tiny pellets, the pellet disappears, and then his score goes up, I think, by 10 points or something. If Pac-Man touches a ghost, he dies, and the number of lives is decremented. If Pac-Man ever touches one of those big pellets, I think you get some score increase, and then the ghosts become afraid of you and start running away. And if you eat the ghosts, you get increasing numbers of points. Ghosts eventually go back to being non-blue and scared of you after a timer exhausts, and then start chasing you again. And dead ghosts can go back and get new sheets down in the center there. And if you eventually eat all the pellets on the maze, you go on to the next level, right? So those are the mechanics of Pac-Man. Now, when we think about Pac-Man, and we think about those mechanics, I mean, the mechanics work well. I mean, Pac-Man is still a really great game. I mean, it's one of the, it's the one arcade game in the United States that you still see everywhere, not in arcades, right? In the United States, you'll be in a diner, in the lobby of a diner or restaurant. You'll see it sometimes at a gas station. Sometimes I've seen them at airports, in college campuses, whatever. There'll be usually it's actually a Ms. Pac-Man machine, but you'll see a Ms. Pac-Man machine, and if a modern gaming person plunks some quarters into Ms. Pac-Man, they will have a pretty amazing, compelling experience all these decades later, right? So it's an example of a very elegant combination of game mechanics that produces a very compelling experience, but we would not really think that those mechanics are all that meaningful in and of themselves, right? They don't really tell us anything about ourselves. They don't make us think differently. There's nothing to read in them. There's no metaphor for anything. So the idea with a game like Passage is that you build a network of mechanics similar to the mechanics in Pac-Man, just unique mechanics to this game, but the mechanics have meaning, right? The mechanics are metaphorical. The mechanics are like the lines of a poem, right? That you can read these mechanics and understand them as you play the game and interact with them and discover what the mechanics are, to sort of piece together some realization about life or something like that, right? And so I made a couple more games that were kind of along these lines, like Gravitation has a totally different set of mechanics than Passage, but also gives you kind of realizations and stuff through the mechanics. Like at the end, you could kind of basically, it's like at the end of playing this, just like at the end of writing a poem, reading a poem, you could maybe write a little essay saying what you thought the game meant, right? And my game Between was also along these lines, but after I made several games like this, it kind of felt like this approach had kind of run aground, right? I was like, I don't know. It kind of feels like, maybe like a high school English class where you're reading a poem and being asked what it means, right? And I think the seashell in the poem is her father's heart. So anyway, it kind of felt also like the kinds of works that we're talking about above the line aren't really doing that, right? I mean, for the most part, you don't go see a movie and like look for symbolism throughout the movie and see the movie as a metaphor for things. You don't really do that in novels either. I mean, some novels are symbolic or something, but not very many. There's something else going on in a lot of these works. And that is, I think that a lot of them are sort of creating, this is a pretty complicated idea, I think, and pretty hard to put into words. But I think that they are creating an aesthetic, a unique aesthetic experience in the context of their own the unique properties of their own medium, right? Where the experience that they create is hard to put into words, hard to write an essay about that's meaningful, right, in your high school English class. If you say, hey, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, at the end of that album is a song called A Day in the Life. Now, you might be able to analyze the lyrics in there and kind of explain what they mean, but that doesn't really capture what A Day in the Life is about or what the experience is of listening to A Day in the Life, which a number of people think is one of the great musical works of the 20th century, that song, right? And you can't put it into words. It gives you this feeling, and I can't even describe the feeling, right? And a David Lynch film is likewise doing something like that, right? It gives you some kind of feeling by the end, and it's a feeling that it's like a unique cocktail of emotions and aesthetic appreciations or something that are kind of delivered by this vessel that couldn't be delivered in any other way. And in Passage and in some of my games, there is a little bit of that, right? And so I was like, Passage has these mechanics that you can interpret and say, once you pick up the spouse, you two walk together and you're too wide now to fit down into the narrow passageways that you used to be able to go into as a single person. That's clearly a metaphor for the compromises that you make when you're in a relationship, right? You can't just go on a trip to Taiwan. You have to kind of negotiate with your partner, right, about it. And so, but separate from that, there's a lot of things in Passage that are kind of like, ooh, that game felt like something. That game captured some feeling about mortality and life and the passage of time. And there's things that aren't even really mechanical, like down at that end of the screen, when you start off in your life, you can sort of see your entire future shimmering out there in front of you. And then at the end of your life, you can sort of see all the things that you've walked through in the past shimmering out behind you, right, in this sort of compressed form. And it's sort of, I mean, obviously it represents memory, and you could, and it represents your hazy view of the future, and you could kind of analyze it that way, but it also gives you a feeling, right? And even the feeling that you get when, you know, your spouse dies in passage, or the feeling you get when you're approaching the right side of the screen, as you near the end of your own life, that feeling is hard to put into words. And so it was kind of like, that's interesting. So what if instead of, you know, building mechanical systems that can be interpreted, we build systems that just kind of create interesting experiences that people haven't had before, right? It's like mixing drinks or cooking or something, where you're like, ooh, these flavors are these flavors are unique, and no one's ever kind of tasted this before. So this game Inside a Starfilled Sky was about the human experience of grappling with the infinite in a very sort of practical way, right? Like sticking you down inside an infinite system, a recursive system with multiple layers, and you know, in this game, this is a pretty obscure game of mine, so most people in the audience probably don't know it. But you're like this guy here, and you're going through a maze, and it's a normal shooter game. I mean, you can aim with your mouse and shoot bullets at monsters that are also shooting bullets back at you as you go through this maze. But every monster that you see in the maze, every power-up, you can see a yellow power-up on the ground up in the corner there, can be entered. And when you enter it, you find a whole nother world inside the monster or inside the power-up, with monsters and power-ups and other things inside there. And as you go through that subworld inside the power-up, you can go inside a monster and find a whole nother world inside there, and find monsters and power-ups in there, and keep going down. And there's reasons mechanically inside the game for wanting to do that, because you can increase the value of power-ups and to help to defeat difficult monsters. But before you know it, as you're trying to solve different problems in these levels and entering monsters and power-ups to solve the problems, you get so deep inside that you forget where you're at or why you were down there in the first place. And that experience, I can describe that to you. Oh, getting so deep down inside this multiple layers of recursion that you forget where you're at. Eventually you rise back out, and you remember where you were at, and you have this, oh, aha, that's why I was down in there. I forgot that I was trying to defeat that blue monster, and by the time I came back out, I didn't even do what I was trying to do, because I got so caught up in side tasks. So that experience, I can describe it to you, but you can't feel it exactly how it feels unless you play this game, right? And that, as far as I'm aware, there's not very many experiences of any kind that deliver exactly this feeling, right? So it's like, this game had to be made in order for you to have that very unique feeling and experience. And that kind of feels a little bit closer to, you know, what some of these, you know, these works are doing, right? Like, you know, what is a book, like a novel like Lolita, what does that capture, right? And it's unlike any other thing, right? So other games that are kind of in that category are like, you know, the Castle Doctrine, which is a game that's meant to give you this bizarre sort of nightmarish cocktail of violation and vulnerability, and put you in situations where you're tempted to violate other people who are real people, other people in the game, and they're tempted to violate you, and you're both victimized and a victimizer in the context of a home security nightmare from 1991, which was the peak of violent crime in the United States. So, you know, in playing this game, it gives you a lot of interesting feelings that you don't really get in other games, and that's the point, right? There's not any sort of metaphor to any of this stuff. I mean, it takes place in a historical context. And likewise, a game like Cordial Minuet, which is a gambling game played for real money, is just almost meant to give you that experience of vying up against another human being, an anonymous human being in this case, for real money, and sort of losing yourself to those demons of competition and sort of exploitation of other people. So that kind of felt like an approach forward. And I think that, you know, if we talk about a game like Braid, I think that it kind of does this too, right? I mean, some of the things in Braid can be seen as, like some of the puzzles can be seen as somewhat metaphorical, but it's more about the entire experience and the feeling that it gives you and the complex ideas that are sort of stitched together into this unique tapestry. yeah, so I think that seems like sort of a valid way forward, and maybe what we should be doing more of. I mean, I think that that part of the problem, and going all the way forward up to 1 hour in life, I mean, this game also is doing something like this, right? I mean, it's giving you a very unique experience of living a complete life inside the context of this world and interacting with other people who are your family members, and what it feels like to have family members inside a game, what it feels like to have a baby inside the game, and the baby is another player, what it feels like to have complicated, consequence-rich interactions in the context of this multiplayer world. And I think, so that's another thing that I think is important. When we talk about a game like, you know, Mask, which gives you real choices that have real impact. I said before that it doesn't really feel like it matters. It's fun to make these choices and it's somewhat interesting, but it doesn't feel like it has real impact. Part of that is because there's no permanent consequences to what you're doing. And I think that so the multiplayer games, like 1 Hour, 1 Life, like the Castle Doctrine, are examples of games where your actions have real consequences, and they have real consequences because there are other players on the other end experiencing. Like if in 1 Hour in Life you have a baby and there's crying there on the ground and you just walk away, that baby is going to die, right? And okay, so what? I let my baby die. Well, that baby was another person, right? Another person who was going to be a unique contributor to your village who will never be in your village again. You will never get another chance to see what happened if you raised that baby, see what happened if you took the other choice and picked it up. Because the world has the simulation that's going forward, other players are witnesses in the simulation, and there's no way to live the same life twice. Whatever choices you make in your life create this unique life that you know will never ever happen again in exactly the same way. So that makes, like, when you're making a choice in 1 Hour of Life, it feels somewhat, I mean, it's not real. Like, I didn't really let my baby die, right? It's happening in a video game. There's not anything real happening there, but it feels as real as dropping a character off a cliff in a movie feels real, right? Real enough that you can get somewhat emotionally invested in what's going on. Another example of this, I think, is games that don't let you play the same situation ever again. So this is a single-player game. This isn't relying on other players or an ongoing simulation online to make things have consequence. But Spelunky gives you a randomized world every time you play it. It's very difficult. This is an example situation where the player only has 1 heart left. That means they can be hit by 1 more monster before the entire adventure is over and they start over from scratch in a whole new world. They're making maybe a difficult choice down here in the store where they might be tempted. They only have 4 bombs and they'd like some more, and they might be tempted to steal all those bombs, but they might not have enough money for all of them, or especially the big box. So they might be tempted in this situation to rob the store, in which case the store owner is going to pull out a shotgun and come after them. And that might be a big mistake, right? And you know, the store owner comes after them and kills them with the shotgun. They lose whatever progress they've made up to this point, and they can't go and ever try that choice again, like to rob the store or not to rob the store in the context of this world. So I think that, and they have a lot on the line here, right? So the choices feel like, ooh, like I'm going to lose this entire progress that I've made here if I make a bad choice in this situation. My choice really matters. There's no way to rewind it, no way to go back and try the other branch. So that helps, I think. Maybe it doesn't help as much, though, as having an ongoing simulation that is witnessed by other players, right? There's something about like, hey, 10 people in my village saw me commit this murder when I murdered my brother. They will have that memory forever. So there is a sense that the thing that happened has more consequences and is more permanent. I mean, in Spelunky, it's like, yeah, I've got a lot on the line here. This choice, I'm never going to get to make this choice again, but at the same time, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, no one's really watching me. It's not really having impact on other people. So I guess I've kind of come to the conclusion over time that this sort of multiplayer stuff is a pretty rich environment to explore this kind of stuff in, right? Because everything kind of is a little bit more real. I think that's important. So there's one more thing that I want to talk about. Do I have about 10 minutes left? Okay. Yeah, just one more thing I wanted to talk about is particularly because I'm in Taiwan, and I feel like Taiwan is sort of a leader in the realm of hardware. Maybe, and Johnson and I were talking about this before earlier in the trip, but maybe my perception of this is a little bit skewed from historical perspective, and it's not so relevant anymore as manufacturing of electronics has moved elsewhere. But I think we have. Okay, well, I don't know that we're ever going to, I don't know, for a bunch of different reasons, I don't know that we're ever going to get across this line. So what we might need to be satisfied with is essentially what, graphic novels have to be satisfied with, right? Which is like, hey, we're making great artistic works that are complex, nuanced, and so on for our very narrow audience of people who are into graphic novels, right? Like, I mean, Chris Ware may be making masterpieces, right? But they're masterpieces read by very few, in part because, and this is something interesting about games, right? In part because there's a certain level of difficulty involved in consuming, especially a complex graphic novel like something Chris Ware does. It's not, it feels like work. I mean, even to me as someone who appreciates this stuff, it's not like I sit down and after a hard day's work and just like, relax with a Chris Ware. As I try to decode this page and figure out what all these symbols mean and so on, right? And I feel like that is also something that's going to kind of prevent games from really becoming like, I don't know, something that kind of fits into mainstream entertainment consumption patterns, right? Because you have to try, right? If you take someone who doesn't play games and be like, hey, there's this really great game, Spelunky. You should, or even there's this really great game, Braid, right? Dude, you've never played any games? Let me show, and you don't think you should because you don't think they're worth your time? You should play this one. They'd sit down and they just wouldn't be able to find their way through it, right? They're just not, they just don't have the skills, right? Just like if you sat them down, they're like, oh, I don't like comic books. Comic books, oh, those are for kids or something. You sit them down with Chris Ware, it's just like, there's not an easy path in, right? So maybe we have to be satisfied with, but we still should be making great work, even if we never have mainstream appeal, right? We should still be striving to make the most complex, most interesting, most nuanced, most relevant, most valuable work that we can make, and challenging ourselves in that way. But we have a problem, and this is a problem that does not affect any of these other mediums. I mean, you'll notice that some of these pictures up here are old, black and white even. I think this picture might have been taken in like the 1950s or 1960s. Sgt. Pepper's, I think, came out in 1967, right? These are old. I went and I had just read a book about the history of id Software and Masters of Doom. So I went onto my bookshelf and got out one of my treasured possessions is a Quake, original Quake shareware CD-ROM that I think I bought at Electronics Boutique in the United States when I was in college for probably $5 or $6 because the shareware discs were very cheap. It has an album on it as well of Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails made the soundtrack for Quake, and it's on the audio part of the CD-ROM, so you can stick that in your CD player and listen to it like an album, but that music will also play and be loaded and played from the CD-ROM through your computer speakers as you play. And I went to try and put the CD in my modern computer, which is a pretty old computer actually. It has a CD drive, but it's running Windows 7, 64-bit Windows 7 or something. And it just wouldn't run. Not in compatibility mode, not in, whatever. You can't run it. And this game is a seminal work in our medium, right? It's hard to think of many games that are more seminal than Quake or some of the stuff that these guys basically redefined the modern genres of games, right? The idea that we're going to have a 3D game, and that's going to be the main way the games are, right? Kind of originated here. And then first-person shooter as a genre, of course, originated there. But the seminal work is not playable anymore. I was able to play it in an emulator, at least it's playable in an emulator, but that's kind of like, I don't know, it doesn't work quite as perfectly and smoothly in the emulator as it did on a real piece of hardware. And if you go online and look for a computer from this era, on eBay, for example, they're actually getting really expensive. I mean, it was a piece of trash computer, a Pentium 200. Like 10 years ago, this is like a paperweight. that people are throwing away and recycling. Now they're like $400, $400 US dollars on eBay because people have realized that they want to be able to play these games on original hardware, and those computers are also starting to fail, right? And they're dying, right? So you can't, so the one interesting thing though is that you can still stick this CD in your CD player and listen to the sound, right? Like that still works. And CDs are like 35 years old as a format. I mean, Quake is what? Quake came out in 1996, so it's like 23, is it 23 years old? 35 years old and it still works fine. 35 years old and you don't have to go to eBay to buy a machine to play one of these discs from 1984. You can have a disc from 1984, stick it in your laptop, stick it in a CD player you can go and buy at the electronics store, stick it in your car, and it'll still play, right? So like as engineers, we know how to do this. And we know how to solve it. I mean, and CDs are just like the tip of the iceberg. I mean, like television, you know, analog television like lasted as a consistent backwards compatible signal from like the 1940s up until 2010 in the United States, right? It was like 70 years or something. And when they made the switch to color in like the 60s, they kept backwards compatibility with black and white sets in the signal. So you could still turn on your black and white set, pick up the color signal, and decode it as black and white and still watch it, right? I mean, it's crazy, right? But they figured it out. I mean, going back even further, like, you know, AM radio is like over 100 years old, and still they're making hardware that can pick up the signal and is fully backwards compatible. If you had a radio from 1919 and you turned it on, you'd still pick up the signals that are being broadcast today, right? And records are another example of this. The oldest, like, still working video games format that I know of is Nintendo DS, which I think at this point is like 15 years old, which is impressive, right? That a Nintendo DS cartridge from 2004, you can go down to the store and buy a Nintendo DS and plug that cartridge from 2004 in it, and the game will play, right? And these cartridges are also a very bulletproof format. I mean, this is going to survive. Like, there's going to be DS cartridges left after the heat death of our solar system or something that are still, because these are actually burned mask ROMs that you know, are really almost impervious to anything but like radiation or something, right? So that's the question. It's like, why have we in games, but more so in even broader than games, just in computing in general, not even gotten to this point, right? We don't even have anything 35 years old that still works, right? By still works, I mean, well, yeah, you can go get your Nintendo cartridge from the 80s and go buy an old Nintendo and put it in and get it to play. But you can't go buy a modern, they're not still making the hardware, right? And those old Nintendos, as they get degraded and break down and their soldering comes loose and their components die out, they slowly die out, and the cartridges themselves die out and so on, right? So it's not long-term sustainable to be going on eBay and buying antique systems in order to play these old games the way they were meant to be played. So there's a question though, and that's whether this, for computing, I mean, obviously, thinking about standards, like, you know, they settled on the CD standard in like 1983, and it's been the same ever since. They came up with the standard, codified it, here we are, CDs, they're always gonna be the same, they've still been the same. Imagine if in 1983, we codified computing. What would it be? Like, I don't know, like the Atari 2600, the Atari VCS. We said, this will be the universal standard for games for the next 35 years. And everyone's going to adhere to it. We all agree and we promise, yes, we're all going to make games for the Atari 2600 for the next 35 years, right? I don't know that any of us would be here today, right? So obviously, we didn't want to do that. That doesn't make any sense. And the music, you know, 44 samples a second stereo, which is the format of the CD, is good enough. It was as good as music needed to be for digital music. And it's still the standard today, right? Like any of the digital music you guys are listening to on your iPods or whatever was like ripped off of a CD at some point. So that's like the gold standard still to this day, 35 years later. It's not like, oh, we need a digital format that's better than this. I mean, the human ear can't hear music that's any better than this. So for computing though, have we gotten to a point where we're there, right? Yes, it's not 1983 anymore, and we're not sitting here with the Atari VCS with like hacked, the Atari VCS was essentially a hacked Pong machine, right? That was hacked to have more than 3 sprites on the screen and so on. Now we have these very capable video game systems, and could we get to the point where we sort of codify one, where we say we're good enough now, we don't need to keep making hardware advancements at the expense of backwards compatibility. We're ready to make works that stand the test of time. We're ready to make works that we're going to still be accessing in their original format in 70 years, right? And what would that mean? And so the final question that I want to leave you guys with is this one, and it's an interesting one to think about. And it's actually related to something pretty complicated, which is a theory of computation, right? So this is a stupid little online diagram I found of a Turing machine. I mean, it's hard to draw diagrams of them really because they're abstract concepts. But Alan Turing came up with this as a model of computation, where you have a tape and you have a head that moves on the tape and you can read and write symbols on the tape, and you have a finite bit of programming code that is making decisions about which symbols to read and write, essentially is what it is. And that model of computation can basically do anything a human being can do with pencil and paper. Which means it can compute anything that's possible to compute, which means it can compute anything that a modern computer even can compute, given that it's got some RAM that it's reading symbols and writing symbols in and out of. And using this model and noticing interesting properties of this model, they were able to prove some astounding things about the limitations of computing. Among them, that when you're trying to analyze another program using a given program, like you write a program to analyze other programs that can supposedly feed any program in, you end up with some pretty big limitations on what you can do. For example, you can't analyze a program and guarantee that it doesn't have any bugs, as the most simple example, right? Like you can't guarantee that this program never gets into an infinite loop or never gets stuck, because there's always some program you can write that will trick any program you can imagine writing to do that. So then we're like thinking about, we codify this the standard for computing or for games, and you give me a game and you say, hey, my game meets your standard. It always runs at 60 frames a second on this standardized hardware, and I promise that it does. Well, because it's a computer program, there's no way to prove that it meets the standard, which is very different from this, right? I mean, like, you give me a CD, I can analyze it with a machine and tell you whether it has errors and whether it meets the Red Book CD standard or not, right? I can't take a computer program that you give me and answer the question about whether it meets a standard or not, right? So is this, like, you can also imagine the problem being that I tell you my program meets the standard, but it runs a little slow sometimes because there's too many sprites on the screen or something, and so it actually is running at 50 frames a second, and some hardware manufacturers that are making compliant hardware notice this, and they're like, we could make our hardware a little bit faster. And then that really popular game that runs slow on our competitors' hardware will run better on ours, right? So it feels like even if we promise to adhere to a standard, there could still be this kind of performance arms race, right? So that's the last idea I wanted to leave you guys with. So I guess we don't have time for any questions unless, can we extend it a minute or two for questions, or we need to get out of here?
Yeah, we can just take like 2 or 3 questions.
All right. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
如果在场有任何人有需要问问题的话，在走道的中间有麦克风，可以到那边去使用。
Do you guys have a headset for me to hear English?
有任何人有任何问题吗？
Or will you translate for me? If someone asks in Chinese, I mean. Oh, maybe nobody has any questions.
哦，如果好，那如果没有任何人有问题的话，那我们就再一次鼓掌，谢谢 Mr. Rohrer。